Good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Ryan Truchelut of WeatherTiger, and I'm here tonight to bring you the very latest on Category 5 Hurricane Milton, which this afternoon became one of the strongest storms in the Gulf, Caribbean, or Atlantic Ocean in recorded history. There's a lot to talk about tonight. I'm going to give a couple minutes for the audience to come in, and then I'll get started on the forecast, and I'll be walking you through what happened today, why it's historic, why this is such an unusual and dangerous threat to the Florida Gulf Coast, and all about the surge, wind, and rain impacts across the state that you can expect. So I will be back in about 2 minutes and we'll get right into the forecast. Okay, let's get started. So, for those of you who are just joining us, once again, my name is Dr. Ryan Truchelut. I'm Chief Meteorologist at WeatherTiger. I'm a Florida native, a Central Florida native, born and raised. I'm living in Tallahassee right now, and I'm a hurricane researcher, a hurricane forecaster. And in all my years of hurricane forecasting, there are only a handful of days that compare to what Hurricane Milton has done today, which has become one of the very strongest Atlantic Basin hurricanes on records. That's one of the strongest hurricanes in the Atlantic, Caribbean, or Gulf of Mexico. So I want to dive right in. There's a lot to talk about tonight, and not only what Milton has done so far, but what we expect in terms of impacts for the state as a whole. I'm going to start tonight by talking about the key messages that the National Hurricane Center wants to convey for Hurricane Milton. And those key messages are that it will be a dangerous hurricane with extremely life threatening storm surge, potentially devastating hurricane force winds throughout Florida, and heavy rainfall with a considerable risk of flash, urban, and aerial flooding. So, all three of the main risks from hurricanes, wind, surge, and excessive rainfall, all well represented with Milton. And another thing I wanted to point out in the discussion product that the National Hurricane Center puts out every 6 hours with their advisory packages, they wanted to point out that Milton is favored to be one of the most destructive hurricanes on record for West Central Florida when you add it all up in terms of surge, wind, and rain. They don't use that kind of language lightly. They only use it when it is warranted, and it certainly is today. This is the forecast cone from the National Hurricane Center as of the 8 p.m. Eastern Time intermediate advisory that the National Hurricane Center puts out halfway between the full updated forecast packages at the 5s and 11s. So we'll have a new forecast track, new intensity forecast at 11 o'clock tonight. In the meantime, maximum sustained winds with Category 5 Hurricane Milton, 180 miles per hour. The cutoff for Cat 4 going to Cat 5 is 156. So not only is this a Category 5 hurricane, it is well into the Category 5 hurricane range. In fact, it's tied for the third, well, it's in the top 10 of all time for highest sustained winds ever. 190 is the record Hurricane Allen in 1980. We're not too far away from that. Movement east at 10 miles per hour, still moving eastward tonight. You can see the National Hurricane Center keeps this as a major hurricane as it turns northeast and brings it into the west central Florida coast overnight Wednesday into very early Thursday. You can see these watches and warnings already out for the state of Florida. These areas in red are under hurricane warnings already, areas in blue tropical storm warnings, areas in pink hurricane watches. So the National Hurricane Center not wasting any time in warning people about the life-threatening risks that Milton poses to Central and South Florida. Hurricane Center track has not changed very much over the past several days. Each of these lines is a National Hurricane Center track. The X's are where the storm has actually gone, and the blue lines are Hurricane Center track. So you can see these lines crossing Central Florida basically all on top of each other, currently oriented right towards the Tampa Bay region. The most likely track that the Hurricane Center is seeing is a track almost directly towards Tampa. So we're not seeing a lot of forecast changes over the past 24 hours, and I wouldn't expect there to be big changes to the forecast track going forward either. I'll show you why that is in just a minute. One other thing I did want to point out is that if we go back and we look at this part of the forecast track, I did want to point out that Milton is going to pass pretty close to this northern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula here in the next 24 hours. And earlier there was some thought that perhaps Milton's small but incredibly powerful core would go over the Yucatan Peninsula, and of course a hurricane moving over land cuts itself off from its source of fuel and energy. Based on Mexican radar trends that we're looking at tonight, the storm is basically now moving a little bit north of due east, so it does not look like it's going to move over land. So if you were hoping it would do that, and that would be a speed break on its way to Florida, unfortunately, that does not look to be the case. In terms of intensity forecast, this is something you almost never will see. You can see each of these lines as a National Hurricane Center forecast going back over the last day and a half. The X's are what it did, and you can see how much more quickly Milton intensified and how much stronger it got than those even quite aggressive intensity forecasts from earlier. This is the current intensity, 180 miles per hour. National Hurricane Center, as of 5 p.m., is still calling it for it to get slightly stronger. I don't think that's happening, but it is still solidly a Category 5 hurricane. We're going to see maximum winds come down. I'm not going to call it weakening because the hurricane will not truly weaken until it gets to Florida. It will exchange some of this incredibly high maximum sustained wind for size of the storm, not weaken. So we'll talk, and I'll show and tell that in just a minute. But that's the Hurricane Center forecast. Still very much going to be a major hurricane as it's approaching Florida in about 48 hours from now. This is what Milton looks like from space. This is an infrared satellite imagery, so we're looking at the temperatures of the cloud tops around Milton's tiny and incredibly powerful eye. You can see this is what's called a pinhole eye because it's only about 5 miles wide from one side to the other as we're flying around. The hurricane hunters are flying around in it. They're taking those observations. And you can see this is just a textbook hurricane. This is exactly what you don't want to see. It's very symmetrical, left and right, just about the same. These incredibly cold cloud tops, the circularity, the outflow, it's all there. This is one of the strongest storms in Atlantic history. There's two Hurricane Hunter aircraft currently flying around right now through the storm, taking observations of the winds, the pressure, which way it's moving, all sorts of data that then goes into our computer models and improves our forecasts. But I want to show you each of these dots is a place where Hurricane Hunter aircraft flew through the center of the storm, dropped an instrument package, a weather station that basically parachuted down to the surface, and it got a pressure here on this drop of 899 millibars. This is only the 6th storm in Atlantic history to have a surface pressure lower than 900 millibars. That's about 12% lower than normal atmospheric pressure, or the atmospheric pressure that you'd have by going about 3,000 feet up in the atmosphere typically. So that's an incredible amount of power to remove that much air. I do want to say that you can see that in the subsequent passes, surface pressures have come up a tiny bit, but this is still incredibly low. So Milton is a top 5 storm all time in terms of both maximum sustained winds and in terms of surface pressure. So a remarkable storm. And this is just a trace of as the Planes were flying through the hurricane. How strong were the winds? These blue peaks here, flight level winds well above 180 miles per hour. It's just incredible flight level winds, some of the strongest ever observed. And you can see that well-defined peak as the plane approaches the center, it drops as it goes through that tiny eye, uh, and then comes back up on the other side of the eye wall and then drops again as the plane flies away. So just an incredibly well-organized, powerful storm. Another thing that the planes flying around, they take the center observations, and that helps us know if the track forecast is accurate. This is kind of a wobble tracker. The blue line is the kind of model consensus, and the black line is the NHC forecast. So basically tracking that NHC forecast tonight, not too different from our expectations, and we see it's not heading towards the Yucatan Peninsula. So what's ahead for Hurricane Milton? I don't want to belabor the forecast and what the storm is actually going to do, because I want to talk mostly about impacts. And like I said, the forecast is just not all that uncertain in terms of the general story of where this is going. So this is where Milton will be about 24 hours from now, off that northern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. It'll move primarily east until then. And then what's going to steer it is this big ridge of high pressure out here over the central and western Caribbean, and this big trough of low pressure digging into the east coast. And there is a channel setting up in the steering flow that Milton is going to drop into, and you can see it very nicely here. And it's just going to drop into this steering channel and accelerate northeast and then turn back east-northeast as it drops right into that channel. So it's not going to go north to North Florida, because it's not going to go into this region of west to east steering currents, and it's not going to go towards South Florida because it's not going to move towards this ridge of high pressure. It's heading for west central Florida, somewhere in this kind of Crystal River down to Charlotte Harbor range, the most likely point of landfall when you look at the predicted steering currents. Forecast models, they're all in line with this scenario. So these are some of our best global forecast models. Each of these dots and ellipses is the ensemble mean of a different type of forecast model. American model, the GFS in green, European model here in red, and all the models are in good agreement with each other. They're not dramatically different in terms of timing of landfall. They all support Wednesday night into early Thursday morning, generally here in the Tampa Bay region, west central Florida, somewhere from the central nature coast down to Charlotte Harbor. And we can see how models are changing with time. These are the last last 2 days worth of model runs, kind of the evening and the morning models. The most recent one is this dark blue. And so here is the time step for basically around midnight, Wednesday into Thursday, that dark blue dot right offshore Tampa Bay. Not a big difference from the previous model runs. You can see the ellipsis getting tighter and tighter, and that means there's less uncertainty in the forecast. We're narrowing that forecast range down. I do want to point out there's a lot more variability kind of on this axis of the ellipse, and that is variability of the timing of landfall. Cross-track variability, there's a lot less. You can see that's a shorter axis of that ellipse. So I don't think we're going to change where landfall occurs all that much. Could be a little faster. It could be Wednesday late afternoon or evening. Could be early Thursday morning. But it's likely to be in this range of west central Florida. Almost certainly at this point, unless something dramatic were to happen. Talking about intensity. Well, this is what's happened so far today is just one of those things that it just drops your jaw it drops my jaw as a professional forecaster, someone who's been at this professionally for 20 years. This was a real surprise, the development of this storm. This is not what you would necessarily consider an ideal environment. So this is the wind shear map. And you can see over the Northern Gulf. Northern Gulf is not a favorable place for tropical cyclones right now. There's 50, 60 knots of wind shear. But the Southern Gulf, there's this little pocket down here where the wind shear is 20 knots or less, which is fine for tropical cyclones. And Milton's just riding that line between where a storm can develop and intensify versus where it couldn't further north. And it's just awful luck that it's come into this pocket of favorable conditions. And then going forward from here, we're in a situation where uh, Milton is likely to interact with the jet stream as it approaches Florida. You can see there's that big upper level trough. There's this jet streak of very fast winds aloft, 6, 7 miles above the surface. And you can see that while shear is going to kind of increase over the storm as it approaches Florida, it's going to be a last minute thing of when that shear comes in. So it's still going to be in a pretty favorable pocket on approach across the southeastern Gulf. Shear increases at the end and changes up that storm structure in a way we'll talk about in just a minute. Um, all the models are in pretty good agreement on this too. Over the next 36 hours, shear remains quite low, less than 20 knots. That's favorable, and then it dramatically increases right before landfall up to about 40 knots, which is not favorable. Uh, Also, we are going to be dropping down the amount of moisture available to the storm, maybe bringing in some dry air right before landfall as well. That may cause kind of a drier pocket to develop across South Florida during landfall. But it's not likely to cause the storm to uh, lose its impacts. We're talking about widespread impacts because this storm is going to be very powerful over the Gulf of Mexico on approach. It's very powerful now, and it's going to continue to be on approach, and it's going to lock in those impacts while it's out over water. So I want to pivot to starting to talking about impacts now, and the first and foremost among them is, of course, storm surge. We just had the worst storm surge event on the west coast of Florida in the Tampa Bay region since 1921, 2 weeks ago. Surge levels in Tampa Bay rose to 5 to 8 feet. The forecast for Hurricane Milton from the National Hurricane Center as of 5 o'clock p.m. today is for 10 to 15 feet of storm surge between Anclote River and Englewood, including all of Tampa Bay. That is an event that if you weren't alive in 1848 or 1921, you have never seen surge this high. Think about the surge that occurred to your neighbors during Helene, and think about another grown man of surge on top of that. That's the potential here. So, in no uncertain terms, that is what the National Hurricane Center is warning people about. It's what your local emergency manager is trying to get you away from. This going through this absolute hell of 10 to 15 feet of surge, and is exactly what they don't want you to do. It's just why you need to heed evacuation orders if you have one. Further south into Charlotte Harbor, I'm not going to call this surge the worst in 100 years because you just had Ian, but 6 to 10 feet of storm surge is extremely dangerous and life threatening. And again, that is for Charlotte Harbor, Sanibel, Cape Coral, Fort Myers region, 6 to 10 feet of surge. That's a devastating surge event, and you still have significant surge further south along the southwest Florida coast as well at a very high probability. These surge values up here, once you go north of the Nature Coast, these are conditional surge values. So if the storm was to come in further north and was to head towards the northern Nature Coast, these are the kind of surge values you'd see, perhaps up to 10 feet. If it tracks south of you, that's not going to happen along the Nature Coast, but it's something to be prepared for and something to keep in mind. Storm surge warnings now in effect for basically all of the Florida Gulf Coast south of Cedar Key, all the way down to the Everglades. And these pinks are storm surge watches for essentially Brevard County and north, with the potential for strong onshore flow on the backside of the storm. So that's a significant threat as well to think about on the Atlantic coast. So just to show what the wind field is going to look like in this storm, and where that surge is going to be, this is the GFS model from late this evening. And again, this is just one model. The center could track a little further north of here. The center could track a little further south of here and make landfall. We don't know exactly. NHC track right into Tampa Bay, GFS right into Tampa Bay. So that's a good illustration of kind of the center line, what's most likely to happen. This northeast, east-northeast track is what the Hurricane Center is forecasting. And all these winds that are onshore, along and south of the track, that's where this life-threatening, destructive surge is going to take place. So this is the region to watch. Southwest Florida, you're going to get this onshore flow. Tampa Bay, you could get very lucky and it could go just to your south, and you'd get a lot less surge if that happened. Um, but right now, the forecast is it's going to be right on top of you, and you'll get that very powerful storm surge coming in uh, with the storm and then continuing through the night post landfall. So I wanted to show a little bit about kind of thinking about this probabilistically. What is likely to happen with the storm surge? So this is the National Hurricane Center's model for 50% of the time. What amount of surge are these areas confident that we're going to see? And these greens, those are all areas where there's 7 feet or more of storm surge. And I see dark green in here, and that's up to 11 feet of storm surge in Tampa Bay. And again, this is a 50% chance of getting that surge. This isn't something that's there's a small chance of this happening. No, this is a very good chance. This is a 50-50 coin flip that you're going over 11 feet of surge here in Hillsborough County. That's something, again, there's no living memory of this. Think about 2 weeks ago and think about it being another person on top of that and how bad that would be. Now looking at the kind of the what we would call the reasonable worst case scenario. So we're going to exceed this about 10% of the time. Someone's probably going to get this amount of surge in here. You can see this reasonable worst case scenario in Tampa Bay. We're talking about 15 feet or more of surge across lots of Tampa Bay. These dark yellows and browns, all the yellows are 15 feet or more. And reasonable worst case scenario further south is again 10 feet plus. So this is something that there's a huge risk of something that we've never seen before in living memory happening. Because of that, emergency managers across the state, your local emergency manager knows your county best. They know the flood zones. They know the areas that are going to get hit. National Hurricane Center sharing all the best data, all the best modeling with them. They're explaining it to them. That emergency manager is making good decisions to try to save your life. So these counties in red are counties where there's mandatory evacuation orders in place for somewhere within the county. Go to floridadisaster.org/evacuation-orders. Look this up. All the evacuation orders are there. Go to your local county emergency management office website. Find your zone. Know your zone. If you're given an order, you have to go. Think about what your neighbors went through 2 weeks ago. Think about what people went through in Fort Myers Beach and Ian in 2022, and ask yourself if you want to experience that, because there's an excellent chance that a 10-foot wall of water is coming. If the storm goes over you or it goes to your north, if it goes north of Tampa Bay, that wall of water is coming. If it goes over Tampa Bay, that wall is coming. Get out now if you're under an evacuation order. I can't say it any other way. Just listen to the people who are trying to save your life. Why is this so different? You may be thinking to yourself, hey, I've been through hurricanes before. I've been through 15 hurricanes in my life. Well, not like this one. There's a National Hurricane Center has a forecast for a Category 3 hurricane come directly into Tampa Bay, and that is something that has not happened in 103 years. This is a map of every major hurricane since 1851 that's made landfall somewhere between Cape Coral and the northern nature coast. You've got Ian, you've got Charlie, you've got a storm in 1873, and you've got the 1921 Tarpon Springs hurricane, which made landfall as a Category 3 just north of Tampa. And what did it do in Tampa Bay? Well, let me show you what it did in Tampa Bay. This is a modeling study performed by the National Weather Service Local Forecast Office in Tampa Bay. They know the region, they're experts, they've lived and work in Tampa Bay, and they know the area. These are people who have dedicated their life to the study of meteorology, keeping people safe from hazardous weather. This is a modeling study they did to better understand what happened in 1921. Category 3 making landfall up here in Tarpon Springs, moving northeast at 15 miles per hour, coming in at low tide. These are the surge values across Pinellas and Hillsborough County. We're talking about anywhere from 8 to 12 feet of storm surge, with that coming in at low tide. Let's take a look at high tide. What if the tide is a couple feet higher, 3 feet higher on top of that? What do they see in that modeling study? 15-foot surge in downtown Tampa, 10 to 15-foot surge in Pinellas County. That happened in 1848. City of St. Petersburg was cut off and was an island temporarily due to the surge of the Great Gale of 1848. It happened 175 years ago. It could happen again. And that's the situation that we're looking at right now. So, this is a study of something that happened in the past. You weren't alive, you didn't see it, you weren't living here when this happened in 1921, but we know it happened. And there's a lot more people living in Tampa Bay now than there were in 1921, I can tell you that. Heed those evacuation orders. I don't know how else to put it. Let's pivot to talking about wind for a minute, because wind is going to be a widespread impact of this too. These areas highlighted in purple. This is the hurricane threats and impacts product put out by the National Weather Service. The area in purple is highlighted as being at the highest potential for wind gusts exceeding 110 miles per hour. Wind gusts of that intensity are capable of doing structural damage to buildings in and of themselves, not even thinking about surge. So this is the area where wind is going to be a serious hazard. Area I outlined in red, that's the area that's the highest likelihood of seeing hurricane force wind gusts as this thing moves inland and then across the state going northeast. Not everywhere in this area will likely see hurricane force wind gusts, but that's the area at highest risk of seeing 75 plus mile per hour wind gusts. And then a lot of big chunk of South Florida, portions of the Big Bend region up into Jacksonville. You're looking at tropical storm force wind gust potential with this as well. Tallahassee might even see a little bit of peripheral rainfall with this, maybe a few wind gusts pushing 40 miles an hour, but this is not our storm up here in the Panhandle. So what is the wind field going to look like going forward with time? Well, this is a computer forecast model that starts right now, has a pretty good grasp of what the hurricane looks like, which is a challenge because it's very small right now, but that's going to change as we go forward with time. See a little bit of expansion of the storm going into tomorrow evening, may make another round of intensifying sometime late in the day tomorrow, is indicated by our best hurricane models. And then look what happens here. These greens, that's the area of tropical storm force winds. As Milton moves northeast into that mid-latitude flow, look how much that area of tropical storm force winds expands. And that area in purple, those are your hurricane force winds. They're expanding too. Maximum winds coming down a little bit in this model's take. Probable with the shear. But it's exchanging a smaller, tighter wind core for a broader, more expansive region of potentially damaging winds. And that, of course, is driving that shear, driving that surge as well as it's moving towards west central and southwest Florida. So that surge is locked in no matter what kind of fluctuations in maximum sustained winds we see. It's a little bit short-sighted to define hurricane categories by only by maximum sustained winds, because it doesn't tell you how big the storm is. It doesn't tell you how much surge or rain it produces. So category comes down 1 or 2 notches. That's not necessarily a cause for celebration, because that wind field's probably getting significantly bigger as that happens. So those wind warnings that I showed at the beginning, they're up. Hurricane warnings here in red and tropical storm warnings in blue. So there's an expansive region of those warnings out because the wind field is so large. Finally, rainfall. Here's radar tonight. Not a ton going on right now. Most of the heavier rain is over South Florida and Southwest Florida right now. As we go forward, this is what we expect through Thursday evening, when the rain should be clearing. The heaviest rainfall with this, because of that interaction with that mid-latitude jet, we're going to see probably the heaviest rain be over central and north central Florida as the storm comes through on Wednesday into early Thursday, and rain potentially coming to an earlier end in South Florida. So we'll see that. I'll show you that on a model in a minute. This is the aggregate flash flood risk over the next 3 days, and those flash flood risks kind of with some precipitation out ahead of the storm. The earlier risks are kind of in far South Florida over the next 12 hours. And then as the storm comes through Wednesday morning through Thursday morning, it's this band of central and north central Florida that needs to watch out for flood potential, because we're looking at 4 to 8 inches or more of rainfall, some local totals of up to 10 inches. It will be moving pretty fast, so that's one thing to keep in mind. And then just in terms of the timing of the rainfall, this is the European model. And I just wanted to show that as this moves across the state of Florida, you can see here's Tuesday. Here comes the storm moving northeast on Wednesday. You start to see this drier air kind of cut into the southern half of the storm as it wraps off the continent. So that's why forecasters are seeing this potential region of central and north central Florida as seeing the heaviest rainfall and potentially seeing the highest winds as well, just with that jet interaction. So I'm going to leave it there. Obviously, this is just an unbelievable storm, difficult to wrap the mind around. It's difficult to wrap the mind around something that hasn't happened for more than 100 years happening. But everything I'm looking at tonight, everything that the forecasters and scientists in your local emergency management office is looking at tonight points to a once in a century or more event inbound to west central and southwest Florida in about 48 hours. So I'd like to, let's see, I'm going to take some questions. Okay, Sarasota and Manatee counties. Well, Sarasota and Manatee counties are kind of very close to the ground zero of where the NHC thinks that this storm is going to make landfall. So, certainly you're at a high wind risk of 100 mile per hour plus gusts, potentially. Inland, I think, still certainly seeing some of those hurricane force gusts. And along the coast, Sarasota, Bradenton, it's certainly something. There are very high risks of damaging surge in excess of 10 feet. In Vero Beach area, how damaging can Milton be as it approaches? Well, for Vero Beach, I'm not concerned about surge because winds will be blowing offshore as this cuts across. So not a surge risk, probably some tropical storm force wind gusts in some of those squalls that cut through Wednesday afternoon into evening. But we really, I can't put too fine a point on what your specific location is going to see 2 days from now. We just, things can move around a little bit in terms of storm structure, certainly as well. Let's see. All right. Well, I think I'm going to wrap up. I've gone on for long enough tonight. Folks, this is as serious as it gets. I feel like I say that a lot. It's true every time I say it. But in this case, this is a Category 5 hurricane. Has sustained winds of 180 miles per hour. This thing is coming to west central Florida, southwest Florida. It's going to have major, major impacts on the state. So please, if you get an evacuation order, listen to it. Make the trek. Get away from low-lying areas. You don't want to be there. Listen to your neighbors. If they went through Helene, if they went through Ian, they know. They know. All right, folks. Prepare. I'm praying for you, Florida. Have a good night, and I'll be back tomorrow with more coverage of the storm and to answer more of your questions. Take care.